Okay, so welcome to Broadband Expansion and Rural Economic Development. So to motivate this conversation, it definitely has a bit of a historical background. When we think about broadband expansion, it kind of is a bit similar to rural electrification of the 1930s. Back then, if you wanted to be involved in the national economy, the global economy, you had to be electrified, you had to be connected to energy resources. And so during this time, rural electric cooperatives were started to help get utilities, electricity out to rural areas. And those electric cooperatives are still working hard today to continue doing that and provide people with the energy that they need. So in this respect, it was extremely important for any kind of rural economic development to really take place and advance economies and diversify them in the areas. You needed to be electrified and have access to electricity. So now, years later, 90 years, we are looking at broadband expansion. And if you want to be well connected with the rest of the world, if you want to have the same opportunities as other areas, you need to be able to have access to broadband that is reliable and works at a high enough speed. So we have a growing reliance on virtual connectivity. I'm talking to all of you today across the country from Nashville, Tennessee, virtually. And it's super important in the context of COVID-19 and this pandemic is that a lot of things are happening remotely now. And maybe after the pandemic is finally over, there's a lot of data showing that people really like working remotely and might want to continue that trend. So this is important for education. People are going to school via the internet. For labor access, people are working remotely, like I am right now. And for employment, if you even want to get a job, to apply to one, you probably need access to the internet. It's not just about circling ads in the newspaper anymore. And it even has health consequences. There are new resources like telehealth that really help people. And you can even talk a little bit about mental health, especially now when people have to be isolated. And one of the great things about broadband connectivity is that it helps you stay in contact with people and with loved ones, and can really improve your mental health and social health as well. So this is super important for many reasons, and it's pretty necessary for economic development in rural areas. So here are some more reasons about why broadband connection is important. When we're talking about broadband connection, we are kind of talking about the access to information and communication technology, or ICT. Access to these technologies is important for business competitiveness, to access different markets. It's important for labor access to remote work, like I was talking about. It can even potentially alleviate urban congestion with fewer people commuting if they were working remotely more often. And we might even see some positive effects on the environment with decreasing emissions from fewer people driving around to work. Access to online educational resources and institutions is very important. Innovation levels is important. If you want to communicate with people and share ideas and innovate, well, broadband connectivity and ICT technology is helpful for that. And it also lowers consumer search and information cost, and it kind of changes the economy to be a little more consumer driven as people have easier access to information about things that they want to buy or to get. We can dive a little bit further into the importance for rural economies specifically. So when you're thinking about competitiveness for businesses, you can also think about site selection. So if I'm thinking about putting a business headquarters somewhere, I won't even consider a place that doesn't have adequate broadband connectivity. Also, your local businesses can have potentially access to larger markets and access to cooperate with other similar businesses in other areas of the country. It can help a lot with economic diversity. A lot of rural economies are really extraction-based, and there's not a lot else to do. So if you can attract new businesses and if you can have remote work in those areas, that would improve economic diversity, and it might even improve population trends. Currently, a lot of people leave rural areas. Maybe they're born, they're raised there, and then they leave. Because there aren't a lot of diverse opportunities for employment in those areas. So basically what we're talking about here with improving broadband in rural areas is improving the amenity of those areas and hopefully improving population trends. You can also talk about equity. With this, it's pretty closely tied to educational resources when you're talking about connectivity and broadband. So what we're talking about here with, a divide between urban and rural and broadband access and less broadband access is often referred to as the digital divide. So this map is from 2017 data given by the US Census. And the gray states are showing 70 to 61% of households with broadband access. And the dark purple are showing 84 to 79% of households with broadband access. So just by looking at this map, you can kind of see that the Southeast is struggling the most with rural access to broadband. And they're also a group of states that historically are trying to improve economic development as well. So we're going to take a pretty deep dive into Mississippi today. Our model is a Mississippi counties model that we're going to show you. And so we're going to dive pretty deeply into different counties of Mississippi and how that breaks out. We've chosen to do this today because, broadband expansion is kind of a national and a federal issue, especially with the Biden administration campaigning on promises like that. And so when you look at things nationally, though, it's a little bit harder to see really where are the rural areas that we're talking about. So we're going to look at Mississippi, and this map shows the percentage of population by county with access to 25 megabits per second of download speed broadband coverage. 25 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits per second of upload speed is the Federal Communications Commission's standard for quality broadband connection. The lighter areas have less access and the darker areas have more access. You can see the central kind of darker area, that's going to be places like Hinds County containing Jackson, Mississippi, which is the capital. And then if you look closer to the border to where the Mississippi River runs, you'll see Issaquena County, and that is a more rural area. This chart of tables shows some pretty interesting information, so we can spend a little bit of time here. All of these counties that I have listed here, highlighted in yellow, are the 30 counties in Mississippi with the least amount of access to 25 megabits per second of broadband. They all have access under 70%. So we can look at the county, the population, and the percent of that population with access to broadband, and the percent of that population in poverty, and the percent of that population that is not white. When we talk about economic development, often race is a really important part of that, and it's always part of the conversation. So I have included that in the tables. So the trend that I'm seeing here is that as the access to broadband is low, then so is the population. If we look at Issaquena County, they have the lowest population, one of the lowest percentages of people with broadband access. They have the highest percentage of population that are in poverty, and they have a pretty high population that is not white. Now, there isn't a super strong correlation suggested here with race, poverty level, and population and broadband access. I mean, you can look over at Teshouma County. They have pretty low broadband access, but their poverty level is pretty low, and they have mostly white population. We can look at the next page, which is going to show the rest of the table, which are all the counties that have above 70% access. Right? We can look at Hinds County, which is on the second table, and it has the highest population. It has 94% of the population having access to 25 megabits per second of broadband or higher. And it has a semi-low percent poverty level, but a very high level of non-white residents. This graph is going to show that correlation between broadband coverage levels and population. As the population, being the blue bars, increases, so does the percent of that population with access to broadband. Issaquena County is listed towards the beginning with the lowest population, and then Hinds County is the tallest column that you see. So as we mentioned earlier a little bit, broadband expansion policy is something that has been talked about recently in politics. It has been talked about by the Biden campaign and by a lot of members of Congress. So some of the campaign promises that Biden suggested are expanding broadband or wireless broadband via 5G and investing $20 billion in rural broadband infrastructure. That's building the power lines and building the infrastructure that brings broadband and connectivity to people. So that's like construction jobs and things like that. And then we have increased funding for rural broadband expansion grants, such as the Community Connect grant. That includes things as well, like making sure broadband is affordable as well, like with the Digital Equity Act. And then there's support for municipally-owned broadband networks. The FCC has the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, and Congress recently directed them to spend $3.2 billion to help Americans pay broadband bills. This is kind of a piece of stimulus, as it's very important for Americans to still be able to pay their broadband bills during the pandemic so that they can stay connected. So we're going to get into modeling broadband expansion soon. And here are some reasons why modeling is important, not even just for broadband issues, but for any kind of economic development projects or policies that people might be thinking about. So with a model behind you, you can have better success with grants and other funding application. It can help you know how to invest in your regional economy. It can help you know what your regional economic impact is. It aids in analysis and an increase of efficacy of economic development efforts. And you can make data-driven project proposals and data-driven arguments to defend projects and spending. So people want to know, hey, we're going to do this project, we're going to do this policy, we're going to spend this much money on it, where's it going to go, what's it going to buy me? Or this is what we did and this is why it's good. These are all the great benefits that have happened. So that's kind of what we do at REMI. It's our bread and butter about helping people to just make great policy. So in the model demo, these are the inputs that we are working with. So we've decided to affect the 30 Mississippi counties with broadband coverage below 70% that I showed earlier, those yellow highlighted counties. What we're going to do to these counties in the model is we'll increase labor productivity in manufacturing and the service industries to show increased labor productivity from better access to broadband. We'll increase it by 5% for manufacturing and 10% for services. These numbers were gotten from an article by Thornfield, Delaney, and Elixman on behalf of the European Commission. And then we are going to increase government spending in Mississippi. So we're going to say, okay, they're passing a federal policy to increase broadband expansion and to pay for building broadband and stuff. So we're going to put that federal funding into Mississippi here, and we're going to put it into like broadband affordability and maintenance funding. And then we'll also increase construction and telecommunication sales. Construction sales are going to show that boom in construction initially in the beginning of projects when they're building the infrastructure, and then the telecommunication sales show an increase in internet consumption when people have better access to broadband. Another thing to keep in mind here is that we're kind of pumping in a lot of federal spending into Mississippi in this scenario. But if you wanted to look at this on a federal level, on a national level, you know, you'd see federal spending, but then you'd also have to model things with changing federal budget or changing federal taxes. But since we're just looking at Mississippi, we don't really have to deal with like the Mississippi state budget and things like that. So this demo is, you know, can be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, as we've done a lot of things for simplicity's sake to have a smooth webinar for you guys. All right, I will now pull up the model. Okay, this is what the REMI PI Plus model looks like in the, this is the home page. We've got the regional simulation tab, which we'll click on. And then this is the regional control. So our models have a baseline simulation that is the baseline assumption for what the economy is going to do if we don't do anything to it in the model. And then the model forecast that we'll run will show us some of the differences and changes in trends compared to the baseline forecast. So what you can do is click into new regional simulation. And then I'll show you some of the variables. So here is our variables list. These are all the variables on the side. You can click on them and they'll give you a definition of what you're talking about. For example's sake, I'll show you how we kind of did things with labor productivity. So here's labor productivity. I'll select that. And then we'll include effect on labor intensity to allow output to grow with labor productivity. And then you'll select your industry. So the industries that I said we'd affect are the manufacturing industry as well as services. So there they are. And then the regions we're affecting are going to be these 30 regions that we were talking about. And then we'll go to units. We'll change the percent labor productivity. And then here's what it looks like. Oh, it looks like I've already done this before, but here they are. And then you can just put in the values that you want. I'll just show you an example for one of them. So we said a 5% increase for the manufacturing industry. And there it is. And then you'll add it to the inputs. And that's what we did. So I'm not going to run this here because I've already run it, and I just wanted to show you kind of what the process looks like of using the model. So now we will get into what it looks like when you run it. So it always starts off with the economic summary table. I'll just show you the full list of inputs that we were talking about before. Here's labor productivity in manufacturing and in services. Here's federal civilian government spending for that aid we were talking about. And it's we put it in each of the counties, and we just aggregated it all the same for each county for simplicity's sake. And then we've got construction. So this shows an initial increase in construction sales as you got to build the infrastructure, and then it gradually decreases. And then here's industry sales for telecommunications. Shows a bit of a gradual increase as people get more access to the market, and then it stays high as people have better access to the telecommunication industry. All right, now the results, fun part. Okay. So we'll start by looking at, just a moment. We will start by looking at total employment, population, and labor force. Right now we're looking at it for the counties that we affected at 70% below, or below 70% access. So this is population in terms of, see if I can get it to show me, terms of thousands. So right here in 2030, it looks like we've got 5.681 thousand people living or projected to live in these counties. So right now we're looking at differences. So this is showing the difference between what this forecast predicts and what the baseline forecast predicts. So that number I was just showing, it's like that many thousands of people more are living there in 2030 than we had originally predicted in the baseline. So total employment is going to be this dark blue line. And you can see that initial spike right in the middle of in 2021. And that's the kind of some of the effect from construction and from that increased sales and from making the broadband infrastructure. And then you've got labor force increasing as well. So with this, these counties are having higher levels of labor force, population, and total employment than they would have at these points in time. We can look at levels to show kind of what we're talking about with differences. So if you're looking at population, it looks like it goes down a bit and then comes back up. So what that suggests is that in the baseline forecast, we were seeing people leaving these counties, but now that we have basically increased the amenity of these counties, we're seeing these people stay. So these large differences are the differences that it makes when people stay in these rural communities rather than leaving. We can also take a look at all of the regions for Mississippi. It looks pretty similar here. It looks like we have overall people staying in Mississippi more often as well, and people actually working in Mississippi more, and more jobs staying in Mississippi. And then we can look at other regions. These are the unaffected regions. These are like Jackson and Hinds County and the more populated and well-covered areas of Mississippi. So we're saying, okay, so it looks like employment is positive, and then we've got population being positive for a while and labor force being positive for a while, and then decreasing. So it looks like the amount of people that we were expecting to be living in these counties in the baseline forecast is actually long-term going to be lower than we were expecting. And that is likely because people aren't migrating from these rural economies as much into the more urban areas. They're staying in the rural areas, and so they're getting maybe a lower influx of migrants. Okay, now we can look and move on to, oh, actually one more thing I wanted to show you is we can also look at individual counties too. This might be interesting. Let's see. None, and then we'll click uncheck, and let's do Issaquena and Hinds County. So here's Issaquena County. Employment, labor force, population, looks great for them, pretty good for economic development. Hinds County, we're also seeing employment, labor force, and population looking good for them. It looks like there is some great overflow in, we're spurring on economic development in these rural areas. We're basically just funneling tons of federal spending into Mississippi here. So we'll see some nice spillover effects into more populated counties as well. So here we can look at GDP and output. It's going to load for a little bit here because we've done this all the way out to 2060, which is as far out as the model goes. Okay. So I've got the legend on. Gross domestic product and output. Increasing, the differences are positive. There's more gross domestic product and more output than we would have expected. We can check out levels. Right, so not only are we maintaining and avoiding loss of GDP and output, we're actually increasing it, which is great to see. Because it's, kind of what you want to do when you're expanding broadband. We can look at the other regions as well. And they are also experiencing an increase. Through the demo, you kind of have to pay a little bit of attention to the y-axis, as it'll change between regions that I'm picking. You can also, model different regions against each other on the same graph, but we don't have time to get into that today. And then here's all regions for Mississippi. Just gonna load a little bit. There they go. So we're also seeing an increasing level. You can check out differences. It shouldn't take too long. There they are. Okay, so here's the differences for all of the regions. It looks like we're seeing overall positive effects for Mississippi in GDP and output. And of course, you've got these initial spikes that we were talking about with the construction industry. And then we can look at personal income and disposable income. We can check that out by per capita. So it looks like we've got increasing income. Makes sense if you've got increasing employment. And we'll look at the other regions as well. Yep. And it's also increasing in these other regions. And then it's going to be increasing for overall everywhere in Mississippi. We can look at levels. Oh wait, levels is going to show us the same as per capita. I meant differences. Here's that spike from the construction spending. And it's going to look pretty different for other counties, right? So even though it's the income per capita is increasing, it's increasing less than it would have. And it's likely because the employment is moving less towards the urban area and remaining a little bit more in rural areas. All right, now I want to go by industry breakdown because we talked specifically about manufacturing, about service industry, about construction and telecommunications. So Here's construction down here. It's got that nice hump that we put in for sales, and it stays positive for a while. Yeah. And then we're going to have the manufacturing industry. Manufacturing kind of follows that trend from the construction industry, and it continues to be at a higher differences level. So, you know, this shows that the manufacturing, there's probably about 0.5 thousand jobs, so 500 more jobs than we would have previously expected. And then telecommunications is also positive. And then the services industry, now that's the big one that really had a huge effect. That labor productivity in services industry really shot up employment. So when we were looking at those employment graphs, probably a lot of what was motivating that upward trend was the services industry. All right. We can check it out for the other regions of Mississippi. And here we're seeing the services industry is up at the top too. It's not as dramatic. I mean, if you pay attention to the y-axis, let's see. We're at like 1.1 in the middle there, and then here it's like 0.08. So it's not nearly as large as you'd expect. You kind of have to keep your eye on the y-axis here. But you're seeing spillover effects in these other counties, in services, in manufacturing, in telecommunications, and in construction. And then I guess we'll check out all regions of Mississippi for a little bit. And we can also go to by specific regions. We can look at a new county. Hines, Sakina. Okay, so there's services, manufacturing, construction, telecommunications, staying a bit towards zero. Well, that's because in Hines County, we didn't really change what's going on there. People probably aren't consuming any more internet than they ever were. And then we can look at Sakina, and we've got similar graphs going on here. The manufacturing is pretty low. It's likely because we've affected manufacturing with labor productivity. If Sakina County didn't have a lot of manufacturing in it to begin with, increasing the labor productivity for that industry there wouldn't affect too much. So this is how you can navigate the REMI PI Plus model, and this is what it looks like with these inputs for broadband expansion. So now I will move on back to the PowerPoint presentation. And here we have some conclusions. So overall, from the little model demo that we've done, you know, we've taken a lot of liberties and made things a little bit more simplistic, for example's sake. But we're seeing really positive results for rural economic development in terms of jobs, income, and population. And another conclusion is that using these kinds of tools, this kind of economic modeling can really help to show what motivates economic development.